For sure, there was a bit of self-doubt that crept in. I think, what happens is that as an entrepreneur, you might have this kind of self-doubt, but the vision for the change you want to see is so much stronger. It has to be so much stronger than the doubt that you might sense, right? And so if the vision for the change you want to see is much higher, then that's going to override any self-doubt that you have. And that's what's going to create momentum. That's what's going to create enthusiasm, energy. That's what's going to get other people excited.
Entrepreneurship is the career up for discussion on today's podcast. Our guest today graduated from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and completed an MBA from IE Business School in Madrid. He has spent time living and working in a variety of different geographies, including the US, Latin America, Europe, and Africa. He has over a decade's worth of experience in entrepreneurship. He's the executive director and co-founder of the Emzingo Group, which we'll talk a lot about in today's podcast. He's also the learning designing facilitator at Kaospilot. It is my pleasure to introduce Ramon Marmolejos on today's podcast and discuss with him the journey of his job. Hit that subscribe button because this podcast will leave you inspired to come back every week. You are listening to The Career Show, a podcast that helps you find the right career and inspires you to follow your passion. My name is Trishant Kansrajani and I'm a student seeking answers to career-based questions that we all have. I'm here to sit down with career specialists and talk to them about the lessons learned during the journey of their career. Well, good afternoon to you, Ramon. Thank you so much for coming on to the Career Show. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Trishant.
So let's get started. And do you want to get started by introducing yourself for my audience?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ramon Marmolejos, currently co-founder and partner at Emzingo, a social enterprise that designs and develops immersive and transformative experiences connecting students to social innovation projects around the world. So right now we've been working in South Africa, in Peru, Brazil, Holland, Spain, the US, and Australia. And right now I am currently based in Melbourne, Australia. Outside of my work at Emzingo, I also have a learning design agency called Alchemia Learning. And we help organizations design transformative learning for their learners.
So I know you through Emzingo. So super excited to have you on the platform. Let's go back to when this journey started for you. You graduated from IE Business School and you joined Monitor Deloitte as a consultant, but you had started your time with Emzingo. Why did you decide to divide your time between the two rather than giving any one of them your entire time?
Yeah, so going back, painting that picture, this is back in 2009. So as you mentioned, I was at IE Business School, and at the time we were going through the big recession, right? And this is the big crash of that time where, we started the second day of school. Lehman Brothers had gone out of business, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the air. So you can imagine all my fellow business students were worrying about what to do. And at the time, my background has been in facilitation and consulting and really around learning and development, and had done a lot of facilitation, particularly around inclusive leadership and diversity, and wanted to do something different. I had in my head that there was a very strong need for a different type of leadership, and wanted to spend time to develop the concept. This was also happening at the same time. This concept of social entrepreneurship was becoming much more popular. At the time, it was a very kind of nascent area. And I thought to myself, well, what if we could create a different kind of experience that helped to redefine business as a force for good? And so, and how to do that in a way that was experiential, that really connected people to really amazing projects, connected them to their own purpose, and give them new tools to do that. And that's the concept of Emzingo. And so that's when we decided to come together and form the company, developed it during business school, and launched it during the incubator program that the school offers at IE. And coming out of business school, I also, knew that as a startup, it wasn't going to start producing money anytime quickly. And so we needed to make sure that we had revenue, and so of some sort, income of some sort. And so I decided to take on a job at the same time with Monitor Deloitte, as you mentioned, and work there for a bit of time before committing to Emzingo full time. And so myself and my two co-founders, we split our time in doing that, and so wanted to make sure that we had at least some kind of income that would support us. And then when it felt like we had enough revenue generating from the business, then I decided to leave the consulting full time and dedicate myself to Emzingo full time.
Well, it's always an amazing experience to hear about how a startup is built up from the ground, and to hear about Emzingo and how it was brought up during your time at IE Business School is simply amazing. But like you said, this is a common path because startups don't generate revenue in the start. When do you think is that moment that people should give that 100% to the entire business?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as you mentioned, I think now it's become even easier to start a company as almost like a side hustle and spend some time developing it and nurturing it before saying, hey, I'm going to dedicate myself full time. I think going in, we knew, and by the time we launched it, then it was down to myself and another co-founder, Drew, to understand, well, how do we split our time and make sure that we can still make a livelihood? And so the idea was, okay, well, let's use business school to launch it. Let's use, the time immediately after business school for me to take on some consulting in order to have income. And Drew was there full time. And then after almost 2 years, we switched. So it got to a point where I was able to have enough savings, but then Drew needed to look at doing some things for additional income. And so I came in and did Emzingo full time. And then after a year and change, then Drew came back to us full time. So that whole process was essentially almost like a 4-year process before we were even full time. And so for us, that was really, at that point, we had generated enough revenue for us to fully commit to it full time. Even if it didn't pay us what we were earning in consulting, it was paying us enough to make a living. And so that's an important thing, I think, for entrepreneurs to understand. What's your, almost like your burn rate, your personal burn rate, which is, how much money, what's the minimum amount of money that you need to live on in order to make it successful? And so I remember very clearly, the idea of bootstrapping is so important. You start realizing that you really don't need too much money in order to launch a company, particularly because so many of the tools that you need and services right now are done in a way that's fairly accessible, cheap, and you can really essentially buy and purchase on a monthly basis, and be able to stack all these tools together that you need. And so it's important to understand what you need as the minimum to live off of. I remember very clearly the first year we launched Emzingo, we needed to create these relationships globally in order to get it off the ground. And so that required a lot of travel. And one of the great benefits of business school is the networks that I created. And that meant that I wanted to use those networks in order to get access to potential clients, and then also as I went into different parts of the world in different cities, I had folks that I could call up and say, hey, I'm in town, let's hang out. Or, hey, I'm in town, I need a couch to crash on. And so I remember very clearly counting something like 30 different places that I crashed on that first year. So either whether that's a couch or bed or sleeping on the floor, it was a way to obviously save money and at the same time expand those networks. And so that's one thing that you start realizing, that when you're starting up, you want to make sure that your burn rate is as low as possible, and that you can do as much as you can to save the money that you need. And once you've started generating enough income, that you feel like you're able to cover those minimum expenses for yourself, then that's when you really want to take the dive and understand that it also gets to a point where a company does grow in complexity, where it just needs the nurturing, it needs your commitment to it as well.
Well, that hard work is so inspiring. And hello to Drew if he's watching this. It's been a while since we've connected. Before I move on to my next question, you quickly touched upon bootstrapping. And I
Yep.
was wondering if you could quickly explain that to the viewers in simple layman terms.
Yeah, so bootstrapping is essentially, really thinking about, well, how do we fund companies? And there are different ways to fund a startup. Obviously, you can access external capital, and there are different ways to do that. Particularly at the beginning, you're probably going to be accessing essentially the three F's, as they call, the friends, families, and fools. So and angel investors that are willing to put up at least enough money for you to cover your operational expenses. But the main way, particularly at the beginning, that I suggest to all entrepreneurs, and I think all successful entrepreneurs have been able to do this, is to bootstrap, which essentially means that you're willing to give your time and effort, energy, and your own personal resources in order to get the startup up off the ground. And bootstrapping really does mean really minimizing your costs as much as possible, right? So really foregoing major expenses like offices and furniture and any commitments that create these large fixed costs. So you minimize those in order for you to essentially experiment and use the resources that you have around you. And so that might require you to obviously give of your time. So that's your kind of sweat equity, but it also requires you to be very, creative in terms of getting resources around you, either free, volunteering. This is when you start leaning on your networks. You start using your own resources in order to get your startup off the ground. And so I really recommend it for sure as a way to start, because you really do need to really go in knowing that you're not going to get income in a startup from early on. One of our advisors, Carl Muñana, who's a long-term advisor for us, really the first one we've had. And he was a managing director at JP Morgan Chase, really successful in the field of business, has invested and supported numerous entrepreneurs. And one of the first things when he saw our business plan, our original business plan, he said, Ramon and Drew, I like this business plan, but obviously we were very optimistic in our projections. And he looked at our projections and said, you've got to think that it's going to take you twice as long, at least, to get the revenue that you're predicting. And you are going to probably produce half as much revenue that you're predicting. So that was one of the first things of feedback that he gave us. And the other thing he said is, you also have to be in a position where you're not going to be able to pay yourself any money for the first 2 years. And Drew and I looked at each other like, no way. Is that really possible? And that's exactly how it played out. We did not pay ourselves until the third year, really. Because we were driving all that money back into the business. Any revenue that we generated went back into the business to, either hire new people on the team or any other resources. So that's part of that idea of bootstrapping, where you really have to go in knowing that you're not going to have much revenue for yourself. And then, so that means you need to be creative in terms of using the resources around you.
Well, thank you for explaining bootstrapping, but coming back to the early days, I told you when you shared your vision, just understanding that vision of yours with Emzingo was simply amazing. But going into the planning days of Emzingo, how did that look like? What were the steps followed? Where did all of this start? Was it in a garage, like people usually talk about, or was it in like a brainstorming room? How did that planning process for Emzingo look like?
Yeah, so I think there were a few steps. One, I knew that I wanted to use that time at business school to start something. I wanted to, partly to go to a business school because I wanted just time and space to think of these ideas. I think this is one of the things that's so difficult when you're working full time, is to actually have the time and space to develop your idea I think that's one advantage graduate school has. The other thing that I wanted was access to networks and a global network. And so I knew that going to business school would help me expand my global network. And, back then, I had a few ideas that I pitched to Drew, who I met, within the first few weeks of starting school. And I pitched him a few ideas beyond Emzingo. One idea I had was to create an online community for sneakerheads, which was one of those crazy ideas. And then this concept of Emzingo of creating these immersive experiences around social innovation. And he said, oh, I kind of like that one. And so we pushed on. That was at a cafe in Madrid that we first met and talked about it. And then since then, we just kept meeting, hashing out the idea. And then we were very fortunate. Again, another reason why we chose IE is that they have a strong focus on entrepreneurship. And so IE has a program called Venture Lab, which essentially allows students as part of the program to get credit for developing a business idea in teams. And so we were actually originally 4 co-founders. And so that's one thing that you realize as well, that over time, just the idea evolves and people's connection and commitment evolves. And so one person, dropped off right after we launched it officially, after we graduated. He said, this is just not a commitment I can make. And that was understandable. And then another person had to drop off about a year into launching it because, again, they needed to support their own family. But it really just developed within that environment of having that time and space, like I mentioned, really meeting like-minded people, and then, using those networks to the point where IE became our first client. That was the first school that we pitched the program and the concept to. We thought it would be really easy, but it was not. It was not an easy process. They were our most difficult client because the school itself thought it was just a really strange concept. Why would students be in a position to pay to travel to another country to work on a project with a social entrepreneur? It just didn't make sense. And why would a school subsidize those kinds of experiences? These were really fundamental questions. And so we needed to convince the university of the value. And they became our first client. And we launched our very first program in June 2010 for the World Cup in South Africa. And that was just, just that timing was really key for us, because we knew that if we couldn't get a program that time frame, then we would be dead in the water as an organization. And so it took 3 months of negotiating with the school before they gave us the green light.
Wow, that was simply amazing. I hope I took you down memory lane as well. I simply loved hearing to that. But something that I want to bring out is that you've been talking about meeting like-minded people. And even earlier, you mentioned that with Drew, you both took a couple of years off and one of you was completely focused full-time on Emzingo. So that kind of partnership is really amazing. How important is it to build such a strong, like-minded team?
Yeah, I think that's critical. Finding the right people is really fundamental to the startup, and making sure that you have the right partners. We're 11 years as an organization. We were hoping to have a big celebration for our 10-year last year, but COVID didn't allow for that. So now we're doing a big 11-year celebration. But I joke with Drew. Drew's the person, that I've known for such a long time, and we know each other so intimately. When you think about it, like, again, it is in a lot of ways like a marriage. And we joke around that we both know each other longer than our wives, right? And so when you think about who you want to partner with, it's so important that you're finding people that are going to complement your skills, right? So obviously you find the right people that you think are going to really be the right fit for what you want to do. And so I knew going in that I had these ideas and really a larger vision for what it could be, but I also needed somebody who was very good at execution, who was very different from me. And so when I saw Drew, I thought, this is exactly the type of person I need to work with. The guy is like a Six Sigma expert and operations expert. And I thought to myself, this was the kind of skill set that I lacked. I think this is so fundamental that as an entrepreneur, you understand what are your strengths, but also where are your gaps. And when you look at partners, they should be folks that can help you fill those gaps. But even more important than just complementarity, you want folks that are going to share your principles and values and vision for the organization. So if you can't get aligned around that, then you're really not going to be successful, because even if you have a lot of talent, if you're not aligned around your values, you're going to see that that's going to really create a lot of problems around the direction of the company, how you want it to grow, the type of strategic choices you need to be making. And so that for us was really, really important. So having the right team and knowing that it's a big, big commitment, and really taking the time to really find the right people, I think is worth it.
Well, I hope Drew hears those kind words from you. But so you spoke about your goals when you were starting out in Zingo. Have those goals changed with time? And is it important to keep changing your goals as time passes by?
Yeah, so it's a great point. Yeah, we've definitely changed our goals over time. I think the vision and the mission still stay the same, right? This idea of how do we inspire, prepare, and connect this next generation of business leaders has always been the core of what we do. The how we do that has evolved and shifted a bit over time. And I think that's an important thing to realize, that your why should ideally stay fairly consistent and your purpose as a company. The goals will always be shifting. And so how do you make sure that you set goals that are, I think, really, really aspirational in certain ways, but also really help you attain and get closer to what you envision for the company as in the long term. And so, yes, for sure, our goals have really changed. I think when we first started out, we had a really big, our original market was working with companies. And so very quickly we realized that was not going to work, because we weren't going to be able to attract these big corporate names up front, because we didn't have those networks. We didn't know that audience. And that companies are risk averse. So they weren't going to take a risk on a startup to send their employees to different parts of the world. So we really quickly figured that out and said, okay, if we're going to pivot, we need to pivot to an audience that we know. And that audience was students. So we understood that universities needed this, and that students were really demanding it, to really apply what they're learning in real time on really amazing and transformative projects. And so that was a big shift right at the beginning, where we needed to pivot and say, okay, how do we make new goals that reflect that?
Even though it's a cliche, if there's anything that COVID has taught us, it's that to adapt. And I completely agree that with changing times, you need to change your goals, because to reach that vision, when you achieve one goal, you need to hop on to the next one. So glad to hear that from you. But you mentioned that early on, IE was conservative with the idea of Emzingo in itself. The fundamentals of students paying for a course was something kind of unique, not seen earlier in the market. When you were hearing these things from IE and other potential clients, did you ever get any kind of self-doubt? And if you did, how did you deal with it?
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of self-doubt at the beginning, because we thought to ourselves, this should be the easiest sell, is the university that we're in, because we knew that if we're going to pivot and work with universities, and we went to other universities first, the first thing they're going to say is, "Oh, you finished at IE Business School. Did they buy your product? No? Then why should we?" So that was the first hurdle. And for sure, there was a bit of self-doubt that crept in. I think what happens is that as an entrepreneur, you might have this kind of self-doubt, but the vision for the change you want to see is so much stronger. It has to be so much stronger than the doubt that you might sense, right? And so if the vision for the change you want to see is much higher, then that's going to override any self-doubt that you have. And that's what's going to create momentum. That's what's going to create enthusiasm, energy. That's what's going to get other people excited. You know, fundamental for us was that the way universities were creating their curriculum and designing experiences was coming up flat and was not what students needed. I think that was a really core fundamental thing for us. The other thing is we understood that what needed to shift was the role of business in society. So at the time, there was still a very strong focus on this idea of business. Really, sole purpose is to create financial wealth and financial value. There was no need for businesses or companies to think about social impact or their role in society. And we know that in the last over a decade, that's shifted for sure, right? The pendulum has swung to the other side. And so we knew that we were on the right side of history. We knew that we were on the right trajectory of where things were going, even if the current state wasn't there. So I think that's how we dealt with the self-doubt. We understood that the direction where the world needed to go to and the vision that we had for the company was stronger than any self-doubt that we had.
Interesting. Something that I want to pick out of that is you mentioned that your vision has to be stronger than the self-doubt that you have. Is it okay to say that when the self-doubt takes over your vision, is that when you should quit your idea? Am I correct? Or if not, how long do you stick with an idea before you actually give up on the idea?
Yeah, it's a fundamental question, because you may say, hey, you know, I don't have self-doubt. I want to push through. But at some point, you're going to get feedback from the system that you're in. You're going to get feedback that's going to say, particularly because something might be extremely different or new, you're going to have a lot of people saying, that's no way it's going to work. You know, we had so many people around us telling us, why would students in schools pay for this? This just doesn't seem like it makes sense. Now we're in an era where the successful companies always have a startup mentality. 11 years in, Emzingo still considers itself a startup because the environment is always changing. We always need to adapt to it. And so that means that we're always in this existential kind of position where we need to think, you know, do we continue? Do we not? Is this the time to stop? And so for us, I think it was really important for us to understand and create very clear milestones that we needed to hit in order to continue the business. Because ultimately we needed to either, you know, there's this saying that when you're an entrepreneur, it's like you're getting thrown out of a plane with all the materials of a parachute and you're told, build the parachute. And so we're always in that position of, okay, how do we build the best parachute given the circumstances? And you have to do that before you hit the ground, which is essentially when you run out of money. And so we're always trying to adapt and change the model so that we can give us enough kind of space and runway to continue. But at the beginning, this is really difficult because, again, you don't have the resources, you have a lot of doubters, and you don't have a proof of concept typically, right? And so this is where I follow the work of Seth Godin, and he talks about this concept of the dip as an entrepreneur and understanding that sometimes people want to give up when you're confronted with enough negativity. When you're in the work, you're always going to get up to a point where you feel like you've hit a wall. And that the same thing happens as an entrepreneur. You're going to get to the point where you feel like you're in the dip and you have to say to yourself, do I walk away or do I push through? And what he talks about is it's important to understand and choose one or the other, but almost always you want to push through that dip because the dip means that you're pushing the boundaries of what's possible. You're pushing against the edges of all the assumptions people have made within a system. And so if you can push through and solve those problems, you can make a breakthrough that could really be a game changer, right? And you can find a way to adjust and adapt in a certain way that then really can be transformative. And so I think it's important, one, to stay true to your vision, your goals, and your values, that you set up those milestones along the way to say, what needs to be true for me to continue to stay committed? So you need to see proof of that. And then when you're confronted with a dip, understand, how do you evaluate? Is that a dip that you want to push through? Or is that telling you that it's time to move on? And it's telling you that, maybe this is just the time to move away. But this is something, like I said, we've continued to see ourselves as a startup even 11 years later, because it's about continuously adapting.
Well, some wise words there. Since you brought up Seth Godin, I just wanted to ask you, is there any particular TV series, podcast, or book that you would recommend as an entrepreneur?
I think there are a number of them. I would definitely recommend, the work of Seth Godin. I get his newsletter every day. So I think it's a really nice piece of work that he's done, and just really good words of wisdom there. I'm a big fan of Tim Ferriss as well, and his podcasts. I also listen to Designing for Business as well. I think that's a really good podcast. And then I do follow a lot of other podcasts just to get a sense of what's happening in business, and listen to, like, Masters of Scale is a really good one with Reid Hoffman and others, just to get a sense of other examples of other entrepreneurs and how they've dealt with challenges.
Well, viewers, in case you want to check those podcasts out, you can find the links in the description. But moving gears, let's talk about you as an entrepreneur, right? Ramon, have you found any tricks as an entrepreneur that has taught you how to stay focused and increase your productivity on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I think one book that I think is pretty fundamental for an entrepreneur and just any leader is The Power of Full Engagement. And in the book, the author really talks about how do we manage not just obviously our physical energy, but also how do we manage our mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. The thesis behind it is that, we have a finite amount of time that's afforded to us every day. But this idea of renewing our own energy, that is limitless, really. And so if we can really tap into that, then we can make the most out of the time that we use. The best way to do that is to create habits that really help to renew our energy. And so for me, the morning routine is really fundamental, to have a morning routine and an evening routine, and then to build in different habits throughout the day and the week that allow me to do my best work. And so in the morning, I'm a big fan of, waking up and making sure that I do some kind of physical activity. Something as simple as a 7-minute workout can be really powerful if you can just make it a habit to do every day, or to go for a run or a walk, whatever that might be. But then also creating time for reflection. And so I've started doing morning pages, which is this idea of just starting off. And one of the first things I do is just to journal 3 pages at least every day, just free flow, what comes out of my head, just to get that thinking out of my mind and onto a piece of paper. And it's a really good way to just start the day. And then as well, creating space for meditation, and so to have a meditative practice of some sort. I use Headspace because it's just good guided meditation. But again, there's so many apps out there that can help with that. And then at the same time, setting the day and making sure that you're clear on what you want to accomplish for the day before you open up email, before you touch your phone. I think that's fundamental, because you're going to be, particularly as an entrepreneur, you're going to be pulled in a million directions. So you want to be clear on what's your intention and what are your goals? What are the 1 or 2 things that you need to get done, and to have that list ready before email takes over. And then in the evening, really having a ritual around, shutting down and creating some time for yourself, again, to do some reflection, some journaling. I think entrepreneurs sometimes, this idea that you need to work 24/7 is this, kind of badge of honor, but really you do your best work when you're rested. And so making sure that you have time for that. And then I think, particularly for entrepreneurs, I like the work of Cal Newport and this concept of deep work. And so how do you make sure that during the day, during the week, you're creating space for deep thinking, particularly again, for entrepreneurs where you feel like you're putting out fires and you're never getting in ahead of your priorities and your to-do list. How do you make sure you protect your schedule and block out those times, at least a couple days a week, where you have hours of just deep work, which I think are really important, because that's where as an entrepreneur at the beginning, you're going to have the time to reflect and think, okay, what assumptions do I still need to be testing? What have I learned? What do I still need to test going forward? Or what do I need to adjust? And to have that time to think for yourself, but also to think as a leadership team, I think is really, really important.
I wanted to touch on meditation out of that entire answer. That's something that I'm trying to practice and put into my daily schedule as well. And I've heard so many entrepreneurs focusing on meditation. Why is it so important?
If you ask me the one thing that would make the most impact for the amount of effort, it's meditation, without a doubt. Because 100%. Meditation, when I talk about those 4 energy levels, it hits on all 4 of them. So obviously from a spiritual standpoint, it allows you to be much more present in your thinking. It gives you time to think more clearly. So from a mental perspective, it helps you focus, right? So you're able to focus on tasks for longer periods of time once you've done meditation on a regular basis. From an emotional standpoint, it makes you stay connected to your own purpose and connected to what's important. And then from a physical standpoint, neurologically, it has a massive impact. The way you should think about meditation, the way you think about showering. I like to shower every day. Now, there's some days where you might say, oh man, I'm too busy, and that's okay. But you don't feel good, and it gets to that point where your mind, it's like a shower for your mind, where you can really clear your head and keep your focus on what's important.
Well, that's an amazing way to look at it, meditation and shower. Well, that being said, 11 years into the job, 11 years into Emzingo, you have the ability to take this time out for you. But I wanted to understand, is there any sacrifices that you've had to make as an entrepreneur? And do you think were they important when you look down upon that lane?
Yeah, for sure. There are definitely a lot of sacrifices. I think you obviously at the beginning, there's a massive financial sacrifice, right? So there's obviously the sacrifice that you're giving of your time, effort, energy, money, but then also the opportunity cost that you're taking, right? So you're going to have to sacrifice other possible pathways in order to do this. And so that's an important sacrifice that you need to think about. You're sacrificing as well a lot of times in delaying maybe, life events. And so all of a sudden, I was in a position where I was, particularly at the beginning of Emzingo, I was not in a position to be in a relationship. It just didn't make sense to be in an intimate relationship with somebody, because it felt like all of my energy and effort was going into the startup. And so really important that you realize that potentially could, and that's not always the case. It's not always the case for all entrepreneurs. But I think it's because of that intense focus that you need on the business that makes it difficult. And so you're also maybe spending less time with those relationships and people that are really important in your life. And then I think there's also just a sacrifice that you have, just understanding that this has now become your main focus, right? So this is not like a job that you can just switch on and off, right? From a 9 to 5. This is something that you'll always have at the back of your mind, because all of us, and particularly as it grows and you have people that you hire, all of a sudden their well-being is important to you. And it's important that you're now creating an organization that's not just about supporting you and your own ideas and yeah, exactly. You're now in a position where you need to support other people. And so that's a massive burden. And so So to understand that you're going to have to take on that burden of being a leader, of being able to lead an organization and to lead a larger team, I think that's a big sacrifice as well, as opposed to, having somebody or having friends or colleagues where they can just switch off and not have that same burden. I think that is also really important, that people are willing to take on the sacrifice. I think entrepreneurship in a lot of ways is very irrational and very illogical, particularly when you think about the failure rate of most companies, and because of the amount of work that you have to put in order for the effort. And then even that risk reward, when you do the math, is actually not very good. And so you have to be also in a position where you're a bit irrational yourself, but the irrationality comes because you feel so intensely connected to the change that you want to see. That's ultimately what's so important, is to stay connected to that, because then all those sacrifices will be worth it once you're able to start, kind of realizing and taking steps to realize that change.
When you said that you need to keep in mind that you don't only have the responsibility of your own family, but also the responsibility of your entire team. As a future leader, that just gave me chills, and I just took a moment to take that in. So, wow, this has been an amazing podcast. As I said, being a future entrepreneur, I personally have learned so much, Ramon. If I had to ask my last question to you, it would be, what is one career advice that you wish you had received when you were starting off your journey?
That's a good question. I think the one piece of advice I would say is this idea that you have to be in a position to take care of yourself in order to take care of others. And so this concept of self-care is really important. It's something that I didn't really pay attention to, and probably impacted my mental health, particularly at the beginning. And so how do you make sure that you give yourself that time and space to develop your own self-care and develop those routines? I think that's really important.
I think that's something that all of us need to focus on. I think self-care is super important, like you said. And few things that I want to highlight from today's call is the importance of bootstrapping, making those sacrifices early on, but being irrational, like you said, like an entrepreneur is irrational. So I think those are some of the biggest highlights for me. And I want to take this opportunity. Thank you once again, Ramon, for coming onto the podcast. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
No problem. Thank you, Tristan. Thanks, everyone.
I hope you enjoyed this week's career discussion. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means a lot.